They're allied with al-Qaeda. They're giving them aid and comfort. And so by the time the end of September, early October rolls around, the war against Afghanistan has started to initiate. And so that happens relatively quickly. The war against Iraq takes a little bit longer to unfold. That really starts in 2003. But we start off very quickly with the war on terror that we're still fighting. You know, it looks different now than it has. We're out of Afghanistan at the moment, but the war continues, and I suspect it will continue for quite a long time.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeff Reep.
Well, obviously that day far greater impact in my life and my family's life than I ever dreamt that day. Obviously, Dr. Smith, Dr. Haymond can give you a much broader overview, insight on the whole situation. Mine's going to be more narrow and personal. And a situation I had no idea that I would end up with 4 of my boys serving in the military. I had no military background at all. And so I didn't even see that as a possibility, when that day happened. And now, now looking back on it, 2 of the boys have actually done 4 deployments, mostly on, crisis response units where within a few minutes they can be pretty much anywhere in the world from different, ships around the world. And so they're going into to manage crises. And then Aaron actually was deployed 10 months in Afghanistan on the ground. And then he was at the Kabul airport the last 2 weeks. His group was one of the first groups in, and then they left on the 29th, basically when everything was wrapping up.
Thank you, Jeff. Dr. Haymond. Well, that Tuesday morning was like any other morning for me. I graduated from George Mason University in May of 2001 with my PhD and was called up to be a part of a team to work some space issues. I was in the space kind of arena, and I was working for a general. And the Secretary of Defense at the time, Don Rumsfeld, before he became Secretary of Defense, had led a commission on what we needed to do in space to revitalize that. And so a general officer that I'd formerly worked for had called me up to help him be his lead action officer on the Pentagon. So I would go in very early. I lived a long way from D.C., and as you know, the Pentagon's very large, approximately 20,000+ workers are in the Pentagon. You can't park there, so everybody kind of commutes in. For me, having a long commute, I would typically get up at 4:45 in the morning, not even shower or anything, just throw on my gym clothes, get to the train station, drive an hour. There's a gym on the way, do a quick workout, shower, and I could be at work at 7 o'clock. That was kind of my normal thing, because I would have to brief the general on kind of the day's activities. He would have a day's activity of what he was doing, but he needed to know what the team was doing. So we'd already had the meeting that day to say what we're doing to implement the SecDefs kind of things, and that was a really big deal for me because the war hadn't started yet, and that was a high priority for the Secretary of Defense, and I was happy to be a part of that effort. But everything obviously changed there. I was up talking to the executive officer after the meeting, and we always had the television stations on for the news kind of in each of the offices. And that I wasn't up there when the first plane hit, but he quickly said a plane just hit the World Trade Center. Everybody's all kind of stunned about that. And it doesn't really mean a lot. It was shortly after 8 o'clock. How did that happen? That's kind of bizarre. But it obviously didn't take this country boy from Arkansas very long, or anybody else, the instant the second plane hit, because I was back up at the office talking about something else. He says, another plane just hit. We instantly knew that there was a terrorist attack on the United States. At that time, my brain's running, and I actually called my wife on the cell phone, because, obviously this is a big deal going down in the country. We don't know what's going on. And I asked her specifically, I wonder what 5-sided building would be a good target next. Because, hey, I'm sitting at the Pentagon, but there's not much you can do. Everybody's just kind of on edge, but you go back to work and you're waiting. The time that hit, it was later, 8 o'clock, I think, that morning, later on, before 9 o'clock or so. The building shuddered. It was just a brief shudder, and at that time I leaned over to the other guys and I, is that what we think? And before we could even get that out of our mouth, the alarms start going off like crazy in the building. I was in 5D 238, which was an old acquisition bullpen where nobody had offices because this task force had just been stood up. We had very small cubes. I was on the opposite side of the building, thank God. I was at the right space at the wrong time, so to speak. I didn't know what to think about this. Obviously, we knew the building, something had just happened, that we'd been attacked. I'm starting to a little bit freak out, just only modestly. Hey, what just happened? Fortunate for me, there was another enlisted person there that was starting to melt down. I could see it in his eyes. And that helped me kind of focus. Hey, let's get out here, kind of take charge. I was only a major at the time, but I was the rest were contract. Let's go, let's get out of there. And all we did was evacuate the building. That took a long time to get 20,000 plus people out of the building. It took us probably 20 minutes before we could get out, because it was just, like a bunch of cows mooing to get out. We exited on the south side of the building, and things are falling on burning stuff, like burned trash almost, were coming down, that kind of stuff floating all in the air. And nobody has any clue what to do. I mean, nobody had a scenario where we practiced, where do we even form up? What do you do? You can't even drive home because nobody has a car. It's kind of, this is not, nobody knows what to do. So everybody's out kind of milling. Are we going back in? And as you could get further out in the parking lot, you could see the other side of the building is burning. And I should have said, once we walked just as we got to the door, you open the door and immediately you could smell the jet fuel that was in there. And even though we were on the outside of the building, because the way the Pentagon was structured, you've got these rings, and at that time, there was it was almost all wide open. I used to go for walks on the outer ring for exercise in the middle of the day. It's a long walk, actually, before this happened. One of the blessings to this was the Pentagon was actually in a refurbishment period. That where the plane hit was where the Army, it wasn't any of the Air Force stuff or the Navy, they were in a different area. It was the Army, but that part of the building was being refurbed, so there were actually very few people in that part of the building at the time, or it would have been a lot more people killed than actually happened. So we got out there on the parking lot, and nobody knows what to do. The rest, everybody's out there, and when I say everybody, it's 20,000 people, so you don't know where the general is, you don't know, there's no organization. What do you do? And we're standing around not knowing what to do, and I'm watching, and this young airman, she just passed out in front out of shock. People are catching. I mean, it's just chaotic. You don't know what to do. I don't even remember why, but at some point I'm going to try to go see if I can get on the metro. This might have been 45 minutes or an hour later, because, well, I guess we need to find our way home, because there's no. Oh, and I should have said there was absolutely zero cell phone coverage at that time, because everybody's on it. So it's busy nonstop. I can't call my wife. I know I know that she knows that the building's been attacked, and I can't tell her I'm safe. So we're constantly trying to call people, and you can't get through. I go over to the Pentagon City, which is across from there. There's a metro station, and everybody is going crazy. I'm wearing a uniform at that time, so I have all these people running up to me asking me what to do. Like I know, I tried to get some, go home. The best you can do now, if you've got, talk reason for each one of them, because they're looking for some authority, because life has just they know that they also are under attack. Just because that building, they're in the town that just got attacked. So it was a really chaotic day. I couldn't get the metro. I can't remember whether it shut down or they weren't running off. I couldn't get out there. I headed back over to the Pentagon area. I was able to actually call, finally I could never get through to my wife, but I got through to my in-laws in Denver, and I had the presence of mind. Call Jennifer, call my father and mother, call all these people to let them know that I'm okay. Because you just, you know what they're thinking. And my dad had told me later, he told everybody's calling him. He says, well, if he was on that side of the building, he's dead. And that's kind of what people are processing there, right? And so they made all the phone calls for him, because there was not that any problem for them to get through. It was just the circuits out of the city. And then a friend that was one of the contractors, we didn't know what else to do, says, well, hey, I can get you a ride out. By then, I think I was able to get to a hold of my wife, maybe a couple hours later, and drove out to Manassas, and then she met me there and took me home. And, it's just obviously a very emotional experience for her, seeing that I wasn't there. She knew I hadn't been hit. But you saw, that. And then this is part of the sad part of the story. What do you do next? I did get calls later that day. Colonel Traylor was our kind of vice, if you will, for the office for the general. Are we going into work tomorrow? What do we do? What's the country going to do? Well, there's a lot of confusion from the presidential level on down. What are we going to do? So the very clear answer early on was, we're going back into work in the morning. You know, even though the building's on fire, right? It's not in any way contained. And so we're going to go in, and then the discussion happened, are you going to go in a battle dress uniform? Normally we're wearing blues. So about 9 or 10 o'clock, they'd made the decision we're going to go in what we would call ABUs, the air battle uniforms or whatever. And so we go, and I go to bed. 3 o'clock in the morning, I get the call from the colonel, you're going to go in and you're going to be in blues. Because then we want to send the signal, hey, the Pentagon is back to business. This is just business as normal. There's no big deal. And we go on in. Now, the building's still on fire. Anyway, we go in and, work, and there's smoke, and it's not probably really any good thing you should breathe. By mid-afternoon, I've got a pretty serious headache because this isn't good. And they finally told us at 3 or so that we could go home. And one of my colleagues reminded me, that smell you're smelling is not just wood burning. And he was right. I mean, there was a lot of people that were killed in that other end of the building. And, then it was just everything I had thought that I was going to do with Space Commission Implementation Task Force was now real small compared to what the military. I will tell you one other thing. I did not see it personally, but I had heard he did it, and I don't doubt it for a second. While I was leading my little cadre of team out of the building, Secretary Rumsfeld, as soon as the thing hit, he ran to where it was and was trying to find out who he could help. That's a pretty cool thing. So that was kind of my day, and then the next day, after at the Pentagon. And we were at work every day after that as we geared up. So.
Jeff, thanks for sharing. As you can tell, there's a lot of emotion still in Dr. Haymond's voice. It's still real. And when he said chaotic, you couldn't be in the United States and not feel that chaos. I was working at a university in Pittsburgh, and we were on the verge of evacuating our campus. We were just 2 miles from Pittsburgh International Airport. We were concerned that the Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville was going to come and take out something in Pittsburgh. So we evacuated. So wherever you were in the United States, there was chaos. So with that said, I want to briefly go to Jeff Reep. Dr. Haymond mentioned about not being able to communicate with his family. Now, you just had a very similar incident with your son Aaron just a few weeks ago, not being able to communicate with you when he was just 100 yards or so from the attack in Kabul. Can you share that story with us?
Yeah, that was a little that was a long day and a half when we just didn't know. The word came out that 13 Marines, not one sailor, had been killed, and we just didn't know anything. Was he one of the 12 or not? And so just processing that whole thing, and just even thinking about, all right, was he one of those? What's going to be our response? And then it was so great to hear that he was okay, because all we had was he sent us a picture of them loading the cargo plane in Kuwait, and then we did not hear anything for probably a week or so. And he said they were up like 4 straight days trying to get people processed, crowd control. It was pretty crazy. And he said his guys actually headed off another car bomb, and I'm sure there were other groups that headed off other issues that there's attempt to have a lot more damage than just the one explosion. So anyway, yeah, that was really hard, and just realizing that he really is in the hands of the Lord. And people are going to say, oh, that's just a cliche. Well, it may be, but to me, it's very real. And just realizing that, he really is in the hands of the Lord, and, all the guys are. And, just I constantly go back in my mind about the guy that did 2 tours in Iraq, got home, thought he was safe, and ended up getting killed by somebody texting on a back road in Ohio, where you think that's really safe. And, or another thing that always comes to my mind is the documentary I saw on when the soldiers were storming Normandy, and the one guy was showing his gun where the bullet was lodged in the stock of his gun. And so 2 inches one way or the other, that individual would have died. So it really is a situation where we know they're in danger, and it just really continue to trust in the Lord that they are in His hands.
Dr. Smith and Dr. Haymond, I have a question that I'm going to ask it, but I want you both to respond to it, and maybe even banter off each other. So, shortly after the terrorist attack in our country, and our political leaders vowed to keep America safe at all costs. That was President Bush's mantra. One way President Bush made this happen was through the implementation of the Patriot Act. How do you think 9/11 has affected our perceptions of whether our liberties or security is the most important? Dr. Smith.
So the Patriot Act does a lot of different things, but primarily for our purposes, it gives the federal government some tools to initiate surveillance against citizens. If you're making a phone call out of the country, for example, then that can be documented. If you're texting people in another country, that can be documented. Things can be searched digitally without warrants because of this. Now, granted, the information is usually searched at a meta level. They're not searching your individual cell phone, but they're collecting information, they're running keywords. If things pop, then they'll start to do a more exact look. When the Patriot Act was passed, it was a 98-1 vote in the Senate. And so there was very little vocal opposition to giving the government more extensive powers for the purposes of national security and counterterrorism. Interestingly, I think in some ways, maybe the coronavirus has reversed some of that, right? It seems like people are a little bit more jealous of their individual liberties, at least as it relates to some elements within COVID-19. But from my perspective, since 9/11, for the most part, we're willing to give up liberties in exchange for security. I'm not even sure it's really a major topic of political discussion. You don't see a lot of presidential campaigns arguing about it one way or the other. The safe position has been, well, this is good for us, it's good for the country, it's safe for us, so let's just move forward. Yeah, there are critics about the war and about the existence of troops in Afghanistan, but the Patriot Act has rarely been called in as sort of any kind of a negative for our country. Now, from the government's perspective, it seems to have worked. Right? I can't argue with results. We've largely staved off anything at all like 9/11 since then. But I'm not sure that we really jealously think about our civil liberties. Some of that is we're just not aware. Some of it is that maybe we just don't care. Safety is pretty appealing.
In economic terms, we would say that safety is a necessity and the freedom is a luxury good. It's easy to be in favor of more freedom when things are okay, but when things, this is historic, whenever there's some sort of crisis, the public will always demand safety and security ahead of some perceived level of liberty that's there. I mean, part of the problems with these things is they always take a life of their own. In economic terms, we'd always say, the economist likes to ask, and then what?
Yeah.
Because it's not just that first order effect, it's always a second order effect. It's just an illustration. A key part of the Patriot Act is to require banks to know their customers. Well, just as a personal illustration, I get a note on my computer from my bank, who I've been banking with for 35 years, that if I don't provide all this information last summer, they're going to cease my ability to access an online account when it's only an online bank. And when after an hour and a half of diatribes with various levels of consumer support, there's that we have to because of the Patriot Act. And when they said Section 136, I go to the Section 136. I pull up the Act, right? I'm doing that, right? And I find out, of course, the Act is for new customers. I says, I've been with you 35 years. You don't need to be treating me. You know your customer. If nobody doesn't know me, you should know me, right? So the government had not, and they finally admitted, their outside auditor said that that's their recommended approach because they want to be careful to not go abreast or arrive at that. So these things take a life of their own is kind of the broader point, not that my bank was harassing me, that you can go much further than that.
Dr. Haymond, I want to stay with you. The war in Afghanistan obviously is a direct result of 9/11, what happened in our country. Has And that war has cost Americans countless number of lives and billions of dollars to fund. Has the effort been worthwhile?
You know, that requires us to know, of course, the counterfactual, which is what would have been if we hadn't have done it, which is obviously impossible. You can't replay history. Here's what we do know. As expensive as that war was, we haven't had a major terrorist attack in the United States since then.
No.
Okay? So whatever else we think we did wrong, let's remember that we stopped Afghanistan from being a base of terrorist operations, and we have now just opened it up to potentially resume. Whether we'll like that response, not clear, but we have certainly stopped with the accomplishment we did for 20 years.
But I think part of the problem with people asking whether it was worth it or not is we're not always clear about what the goals are, right? And we can see, well, we want to be safe, and so we want to avoid terror attacks. But what is the long-term strategy? What are we trying to accomplish in Afghanistan other than just simply security of a kind? And I think our elected leaders have done a pretty poor job of articulating a positive case for the war. Instead, they would try to undermine it or argue they're going to withdraw troops or whatever it may be. But really, since President Bush himself, no politicians really made a positive argument for why we were in Afghanistan. One of the biggest reasons for that is we as Americans aren't all that concerned with foreign affairs. You know, when you look at polling, you look at people and how they vote and why they vote, foreign affairs is not at the top of their list. And if I'm really blunt about it, when you look at the people we've elected as president, they're either very inexperienced in foreign affairs or have a very bad record in relation to foreign affairs. And so, you know, we haven't been real vigilant in choosing leaders who would make a case for this, and this is what we've ended up with, just withdrawal.
Yeah. Let me open a question to all three of you. With the significant loss of human life because of the war and the attacks on 9/11, we believe as Americans that 9/11 was a bad situation. Now, I heard this question posed on some major media outlets, and it intrigued me. But can you make a case that there's really been some good that's come out of 9/11 in spite of the tragic losses that we've incurred in human life? Bless you.
Can I go back to the past question to lead in? To give him plenty of time to think ready for that.
Great.
I'm sure he's going to have a home run answer.
I'm sure.
Because about whether it's worthwhile. When I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, in addition to the mandatory quotes I was asked to memorize, one of my upperclassmen made me memorize this quote from John Stuart Mill. War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling which thinks that nothing is worth war is far worse. The man who has nothing for which he's willing to fight, nothing he cares about more than his own personal safety, is a miserable creature who has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men than himself. And so John Stuart Mill was right 150 years ago, and there are times when it makes sense to go to war. We don't like war. War is a part of the fallen part of this world, but it's a reflection of what we understand, that there are bad people in the world, because that's now I'm going to play into what this question was. Yeah. Was there anything good? One of the amazing things that happened immediately was this postmodern kind of view, and that's out there in the world that there's no truth, there's none of this, there's no evil. Right. I tell you, that idea that there's no such thing as intrinsic evil, that went away in seconds after 9/11 happened. And the positive thing, we are old enough to know it. That Sunday and every Sunday for about 3 months, the churches were filled with people who never would go through a church door. Yeah. So there was a recognition of the reality of evil and the fact that there needs to be something transcendent to hold on to in the times of crisis. Unfortunately, that was all too quick in passing. Yeah, so.
I mean, one of my most vivid memories of 9/11, I was mostly just sitting in front of a television watching it unfold. But that evening, a group of congressmen got on the steps of the Capitol and saying, "God bless America." So Democrats, Republicans, leaders, followers got on the steps and saying, "God bless America," as part of this feeling that people were going through. And I don't know what it would take for them to do that today. right?
Let me add on.
Yeah.
After I finished my time with the Space Commission Task Force, I went over for the Office of Legislative Liaison in Air Force, and so I worked with the Armed Services Committees. And I had some kind of a priori thought that there's going to be a lot of disagreement between the Republicans and Democrats. But I'm here to tell you, in that era, the defense world, there wasn't much daylight between them, with one exception: missile defense. Other than that, couple of strategic issues on how we handled things. They were in sync on these issues of the war on terror, everything else. There was remarkable unity amongst Democrats and Republicans in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, 9/11 created some common ground.
Yeah.
Right? And
We
so
haven't seen it since.
no, we haven't really seen it since. And I thought maybe naively that the COVID-19 would do the same thing. It did not.
The opposite.
It's done the opposite. It's made it worse. And
Right.
so one of the good things was to watch those people come together, work together to achieve their goals. And we desperately need that to happen again. But if a pandemic won't make it happen, I'm not sure what else will.
Yeah. Jeff Reep, do you have a thought on that question?
I'll submit no. I don't think Jeff can hear me.
Yeah, I just heard what was the question?
I just
It
said,
said, Jeff, do you have a comment on this question? Yeah.
No, I think it's been covered really well. I do think there has to be, remember that there has been a restraint. I do think there is evil and there is need for a military. I think as far as how it was done, how we exited, all those things, I think those are going to be talked about in years to come. And maybe right now it's almost too soon to really, give a final definitive answer. But I would agree with what has been said 100%.
I want to pivot a little bit to.
I think the wheelhouse of Dr. Haymond. One of the criticisms on the war on terror has been military spending in our country. With that said, is it conceivable now that now that we're out of Afghanistan, that more money on other projects or issues can be diverted toward those, since we're not funding a war and we don't need to grow a deficit?
Well,
I bet you have a comment on that, right?
Sure, and I'm not up to date on military spending, but I know this: the amount of money we spend on the defense right now, what we spent in Afghanistan relative to the amount of defense, that was very small. We had a very small presence at the end. So the idea that we had like a war going on in Afghanistan, that's a wrong way to think about it. We didn't. We had a small presence, maintaining air superiority and so forth to keep the Taliban at bay. I would have probably had a larger number, but we were down 2,500. It's a very small number. So that didn't cost much. That doesn't free up much resources. The bulk of the spending that people refer to was, in the decade of George Bush and then President Obama a little bit afterwards. We've been a very small presence in Afghanistan for a long while. So there's not much money to be saved. So that said, I mean, being a former military member, I can tell you there's lots of waste in the military, lots of waste across government. Any government civil servant can tell you. But the problem is they won't let me tell you where it is to cut out, because most of that's going to be a reflection of kind of congressional kind of areas of interest that they're going to drive. I doubt you're going to find any constituency overall for a reduced military budget. In fact, there's going to be a case made that now that we need to hit them over the horizon, we need to have additional capabilities because we're not there close by to handle us. It's not all clear that it's going to be even more cost effective to meet Mr. Biden's proposed approach. I don't know if you have
Any comments, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, Jeff knows more about it than I do, but the federal budget is not driven by military spending. Overwhelmingly, it's driven by social programs, whether you're talking about welfare, whether you're talking about health care, other things that drive the budget much more dramatically than military spending. And so it's always interesting for me to hear people talk about the budget and saving money, but unless those programs are brought under control at some level, that budget's just going to keep running out of control. And so, military spending isn't really the problem at all.
Okay. I want to ask a question. All three of you guys are welcome to answer it. When we entered Afghanistan, my recollection was we were doing so to fight terror. We were going to take care of the people who attacked us. But perhaps it morphed into nation building. What should have been the role of our military in Afghanistan? Should it be nation building? Did we lose direction throughout that 20-year war?
Well, I mean, the clear record of all history is nation building is not something that succeeds unless you are willing to do this for a long, long time.
Longer than 20 years.
Longer than 20 years.
Yep.
I mean, you can make, I mean, this is kind of, you know, what the Chinese are trying to do right now with the Uyghurs. If you wipe them out and you colonize the area, you can take it over. That's what the Russians did to the Ukraine and other parts of the, where they've moved in, you know, historic Russians and occupied for decades. Now those things are still simmering at some level, but they certainly changed the culture. But it took that kind of effort and really bad actions against the populace that we should not want to do regardless. Yeah. Bill Clinton didn't work well with nation building. George Bush didn't work well with nation building. And it's uniquely an aspect of the military that we are not equipped to do. I will tell you this, just to finish on that. I remember talking to, when I was on legislative liaison with one of the Senate Armed Services Committee key staffers, and one of the things she said, we know that the military is the wrong answer. This was talking vis-a-vis Iraq, but it's more broadly the same kind of point. We know that the military is the wrong answer. We need the State Department in there. We need all these other agencies, but they won't go. We know if we tell the military to go in, they'll get it done. And that's why the military is sent over to do it, because these other things won't work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Jeff said there, but to put a more positive spin on it, I mean, we still have bases in Japan, we still have bases in Germany, South Korea, and we're not there to colonize, we're not there, but we're there to have an influence, and you can have a positive influence in those places if you're willing to dedicate decades and maybe even a century to that kind of presence. Asking the American people to support that for that period of time right now just doesn't seem like we're willing to make that kind of commitment. And whether we like it or not, you know, there's some responsibility to being the leader of the free world.
Yeah.
Right? There's no other nation that's going to step up and do some of these things, and if we don't do them, then the world's going to turn much darker much more quickly, and we'll have to deal with it at that point. So people always say, well, we don't want to be the world's police officer. I get it, but someone has to. Somebody has to do it. And so there have to be people willing to do hard things. And right now, America is uniquely positioned to do it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for your comments. So yesterday when I was just reviewing the questions with Dr. Haymond and Dr. Smith, I was in Dr. Smith's office and we were going through it, and you can see Dr. Smith kind of get excited with some questions and like, not so much. But I thought he was interested in this question. I'm gonna pose it to Dr. Smith.
Oh no, so I'm not interested at all. Whatever he says, I'm not interested at all. Yeah.
So from a religious perspective, Dr. Smith, how has 9/11 affected our perceptions of fundamentalist religions, like Al-Qaeda, et cetera?
Yeah. So to some degree, we've been at war with fundamentalist Islam. Yep. You want to think of it in those terms, since 9/11. So a hyper-legalistic, authoritarian version of Islam that isn't the case everywhere, but we're certainly at war with it at the moment. What's been kind of painful to watch as a believer is often we as conservative Christians get lumped into this way of thinking. There's a professor at Southeastern Seminary who wrote an article in the New York Times yesterday about abortion and her pro-life position, and she was immediately referred to as the American Taliban on social media, right? Wow. She's gotten hate mail and all sorts of other things because she took a position that now is being equated with a fundamentalist approach. And so that label fundamentalist has expanded to the point where it includes anyone who opposes what I might call a progressive agenda, and that agenda includes things as including abortion, same-sex marriage, and a variety of other factors. And so the notion of fundamentalism has really expanded since 9/11, and we are labeled with it repeatedly because of that. And so it's a constant battle, intellectually speaking as well as spiritually speaking, to try to push back against that. But it's a very effective weapon that people who disagree with it use.
Anyone else have a comment on that? If not,
Let me just jump in real quick.
Yep.
As Dr. Haymond mentioned, he would know a lot more as far as the money side of it. But I mean, we really haven't probably spent that much money. We really haven't lost that many lives up until this last couple of weeks for like, I don't know, 12, 18 months, something like that. And I think maybe time will tell, should we have stayed there, to curtail some attacks. And I think one thing I really just want to mention, I think, is we look at our world situation and say, oh, we're out of Afghanistan, we can cut back defense budgets. I think that could be a mistake. I mean, as you look at China, Russia, North Korea, I mean, there's just a lot of things going on around the world. So I think to come back and say, okay, we're going to cut our budget drastically in light that we probably really haven't spent that much the last few years anyway. It's just a thought.
Thank you, Jeff.
I'm going to go back to Dr. Smith. We all know he's the political expert on campus. So from a political perspective, what's been the impact on American politics because of 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan?
So, honestly, not nearly as much as I would have thought on 9/11 itself. I mean, I knew we were going to see serious changes. I knew we would go to war of some kind. I thought we would see legal changes, which have occurred. We saw the creation of a new executive department, the Department of Homeland Security. So those things have all happened.
Right.
But I really thought that 9/11 might be what in political science we call a realigning event. So this moment where the differences between the parties get shuffled in such a way that you see a new approach to being a Republican, being a Democrat. That didn't happen, mostly because they agreed initially, and then the disagreements that eventually creeped into it were partisan. Republicans took one position, Democrats took another one, and so we really didn't see significant long-term changes. And the war on terror, for most of us, Mr. Reep is the exception. For most of us, it's very abstract, right? Unless you have a family member who's serving, unless you pay very close attention to what's happening, most of us has just been removed from us. Something that's, it's not like in Vietnam or World War II where you have a draft, where you have people from every family serving so that everyone's invested. That's not been the case with the war on terror. So don't misunderstand. I'm not arguing we need a draft, but it means our psychological commitment to it is just not what it would have been historically. And so I don't think 9/11 has had a dramatic impact, honestly. Much less so than I would have assumed when I was watching what I watched then.
Okay. So has the war in Afghanistan, the recent withdrawal, has the 20 years had any impact on the morale in the military? Can Mr. Reep or Dr. Haymond address that?
You've got current ties, Mr. Reep.
I mean, I think that we're out of there. I think there's a certain amount of relief. I mean, I know personally to be able to say my boys aren't, heading back there, are not deployed on Afghan soil is something I'm very grateful for. At the same time, my heart really hurts for those, 13 that lost their life in that last 2 weeks, or the ones that lost their life over the span of the war. I just can't even fathom how that feels. I mean, just because the way it felt for us for like a day and a half, and we didn't even know. And now those families are living with that, day after day, for probably the rest of their lives. So, there's obviously in my mind, there's some mixed emotions. Good. I'm glad we're out. Could we have stayed? Should we have stayed? I don't know. I think historians and that will make those decisions, down the road.
So we have about 10 minutes left.
In the town hall forum. I'm going to go back to Mr. Reep. Back 20 years ago on 9/11 when we were attacked, did you ever think your sons would be serving as Marines in various capacities during the 20-year war?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, whoever dreamt to be 20 years, as I mentioned earlier, I had no military background, so that didn't even really enter my mind. I think as far as the Marines, the danger, obviously there's danger there. And when you're preparing to go in to respond to crises around the world, I mean, it's gonna be touch and go, and I think that's one thing that they knew going in. We knew going in that's what the Marines do. I mean, they're going to be just like in Kabul. They were the first one in, and they were the last ones out. And it's interesting because having no military background, I remember Aaron saying one time, he said, "Dad, notice the advertisements for the Marine Corps. They never talk about accelerating your career. They never talk about leadership. They never talk about education. It's all about the few, the proud, the warriors, the serving your country." And so I think that group that's in the Marine Corps, I think it's very clear that's why they're in there. If they're looking for some of those other things, there's other places to get those. So, I think the boys knew, obviously, and know there's significant danger. Chris and I also know that they're in danger as well, because as they're out on those, crisis response units, I mean, who knows where another crisis could break out.
Thank you. I want to give just the three of you just an open forum right now. Is there anything that you'd like to say that I haven't asked you before I get to the last question for each of you?
I guess I'd like to make sure that we can separate and make a distinction between kind of some of the ways that the aftermath of 9/11 was executed versus the overall need to do something, right? I think there's been a conflation of those kinds of things. We can all wish and think in hindsight, and that's where I think Mr. Reep said historians and so forth will have to decide what could have been done better. But what, often in your generation today, Joe Biden is president today. I mean, he had a little bit of opportunity as vice president, but the reality is we get to inherit the situation we're in, right? And so we could wish that things were done differently a long time earlier. But the question is, and this is kind of where I'm faulting the current administration on, is the question isn't, the goal of the United States should never be to get our troops home. The goal of the United States should be, how do we advance the United States' interest for the long term? How do we for the military specifically, how do we make sure that they are able to protect the American people over the longer term? And hopefully, ideally, we can figure out a way to and bring our troops home. But the number one objective of the military is not to have people stationed here in the United States per se, if the threats to the United States are abroad. And that's one of the most disconcerting things about there is really the art of war. War ends when one side is unwilling to continue in conflict. It's as simple as that. One side will have to give up. And the thing that dismays me about our current situation is we are simply celebrating giving up. I found that very deeply troubling. Not for myself, but for our country to have a certain segment that seems to be celebrating basic national humiliation in my mind. It's very troubling for me personally, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. So should we have stayed in Afghanistan longer?
Given where we are right now, we certainly shouldn't have retreated the way we did. Lots of people, probably smarter people than me, would have different things. But if I would have been doing this, I wouldn't have done what Mr. Trump did. I would have signed a 99-year lease for Bagram Air Base. I would have eliminated everything else, so I would have had a forward presence, and it would have been another assignment for everybody else. And then you can keep an eye and quickly strike anything, but I would have never been in there in the first place in that way. In that sense, if we could rewind the clock, I would have probably been in favor of what Mr. Biden said. And my philosophy would be, okay, if you harbor terrorists, we're going to come in and break you. And then we're going to leave you broken. And if you come back and do it again, we'll break you again. Because part of the argument, you all weren't alive. Well, we've got to go there and do this, because if we don't do this, we're just going to have to do it again in 5 or 10 years. Well, the trade-off, it was a lot cheaper in lives, treasure, and everything else to fight a short war, end the threat in a temporary way, then monitor it and take it out again if you need be. I'm personally not in favor of large overseas things, but once you're there, well, that's been really the crisis. It's like Mr. Colin Powell used to say to George Bush vis-a-vis Iraq. Once you go in and break it, you own it. And the reality is now we kind of own it. We were there. So I think we should have figured out how to make a stable presence such that we could have made sure that region would have had a counterweight. Right now, there's no longer any counterweight to any terrorist group in that part of the world. And furthermore, much more dangerous. We saw this. This was so sad. This was the thing that troubled me the most after 9/11, is there were Palestinians that were cheering when they saw images of the Twin Towers falling down. They were cheering this. There are a lot of people in the world that relish when the United States takes it in the gut. And so today, there are a lot of people that are really happy that we were nationally humiliated. And so that's part of the troubling thing. So we've energized groups that do not like us that are now going to find, hey, it's time to go to Afghanistan where we can have our training ground. And there were parts of North Africa that were similar previously, that they did the same thing. But it's going to be a lot harder, and we may have to do this again in your lifetime now that we shouldn't have had to do. That's my biggest concern.
And that's a real reality, that even though the war is over, it really isn't over.
The threat isn't.
The threat's not over. We're going to have to address this at some point, someplace, somewhere, somehow. My last question to the panel is, we're on the eve of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. What is it? What's in your heart? What's in your mind as we approach this historic time in our life as a history of our country? Mr. Reep.
Well, I think we live in such a soundbite society. Sometimes we don't remember major events and the impact it's had on individuals and on our country. And so I guess the thing I would leave this with is just don't be forgetful. Realize what happened, the seriousness of it, the lives it cost. Let's learn from it. Let's move on.
Thank you.
I mean, like Dr. Haymond was saying, whether you want to or not, you all are inheriting the war on terror. Now, how you fight it is up to you to some extent, but it's not going to leave you alone. So we have to figure out nationally a reasonable strategy for dealing with it. Right now, we're in such a state of conflict that I'm not sure that's really possible. During the Cold War, we had a defined enemy. We had a relatively agreed upon approach to it, even though there was disagreement in certain areas. The war on terror hasn't produced that kind of result. And so I would follow up with what Mr. Reep said. Remember what happened, but be ready to wrestle with it, because it isn't going to go away.
I'll give you the final word.
God is good. He's still on his throne. And every day we are marching inexorably towards the culmination of his story.
There you go. Hey, join me in thanking these panelists. I thank you, panelists, for spending an hour with us, preparing for this. Specifically, Dr. Haymond, for sharing your story. It's real. It's still real with you, and I appreciate you having the courage to share it. Mr. Reep, for sharing the story about you and your son and Aaron, and thank him for his service to our country, and he's a tribute to your family. And Dr. Smith, thank you as well. And for you guys here in this room, you guys were great listeners. Thank you for coming. For those watching on live stream, thank you. And we'll probably do something like this again, so stay tuned. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. Can you see me, Jeff?